Good to see everybody tonight. Glad that you're here. We have a special treat tonight. Mike Vestal has agreed to teach our class. Mike is here teaching a short course for the students in the Bible Institute, and so he was asked if he would be so gracious to do tonight as well. And so we're thankful for that. For those of you that may not know that much about Mike Vestal, he is the preacher for the Westside Church in Midland, Texas, and has been there for
23
wonderful years. And so he's been teaching here at the Bible Institute for about 5 years. I think it's 5 years. So anyway, without further delay, I'll turn it over to Mike.
Wayne Jones asked me to do a one-shot lesson over the book of Ruth, and then he left town. You may wish you had left town by the time this one shot is over, but that is all right. It's understandable. So open your Bibles to the book of Ruth. In one sense, the book of Ruth is among the scariest books of the Old Testament. In one sense, Ruth is among the scariest books of the Old Testament because it only takes 5 verses for a person's whole world to fall apart. Look at Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. In the days of the judges, first of all, we know every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Judges 17:6, Judges 21:25. We understand that the judges were a time when there was no king, and the idea is surely if there was a king of any character, of any decency, things wouldn't be the way that they were. Well, you look at the first 5 verses of the book of Ruth. A famine comes to Judah. Bethlehem, which literally means the house of bread, is a place where there is no bread. So Elimelech and Naomi go to Moab with their sons, Mahlon and Chilion. What happens next? A famine, a questionable move. Anybody ever made a questionable move, or maybe a good move that you questioned a lot? Moving from Bethlehem to Moab. Some might think that to be a questionable move. And as a matter of fact, a lot of commentators want to spill a lot of ink on that. But the text itself doesn't. But we'll just say a questionable move. 3 deaths. And look at Ruth 1, verse 5. Naomi was left without. She was left. Her whole world had come crashing down in a relatively short period of time. And when you look at the 4 chapters that make up the book of Ruth, the setting varies from chapter to chapter. The setting for chapter 1, at least the most part of chapter 1, is on the road. You'll see this in Ruth chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. Naomi feels left and she feels alone. She is a widow. Her sons have died. She doesn't believe that there's any hope. She feels destitute. You talk about financial issues, social issues, emotional issues, psychological issues. All of these things must be flooding through her mind, as well as the fact she has 2 daughters-in-law that are still very much alive. Orpah and Ruth. And how is she going to take care of herself, much less be able to provide any kind of future for them? I want you to know the star of the book of Ruth is not Ruth. The star of the book of Ruth is not Naomi. The star of the book of Ruth is not Boaz. The star of the book of Ruth is God. And all of the other characters have marvelous but supporting roles. God is mentioned 25 times in a 4-chapter book during the time of the Judges. That in itself should astound somebody. You look at Ruth chapter 1 and verse 6, and I want you to think of verses 1 through 5. When tragedy strikes. When tragedy strikes. And most of you realize it's not a matter of if, but when. Because few lives, very few lives, go through to their end without some type of tragedy being dealt with. Isn't that so? So we can immediately connect with Naomi. And that's why this book can be so scary at first. Because in 5 brief verses, everything crashed. Now, verse 6. When tragedy strikes, look at verse 6 and 7. Faith can struggle with unremarkable blessing. Faith can struggle with unremarkable blessing. What happens in verse 6? What news has she heard from Bethlehem and the house of bread? Bethlehem has bread again. Bethlehem, the house of bread, has bread again. She does not see the providence of God maybe as fully as she could have in these unremarkable blessings. You know, after all, famines do stop. Droughts do eventually cease. Talk to the folks in California. Fires eventually do get snuffed out. When tragedy strikes, it is hard to see providence even in the little things. But she does decide to go back. Not long ago, I was looking in our garage, and our garage was overwhelmed with those really big black lawn bags. And in those big black lawn bags, there were plastic bottles. There were cans. And there was a lot of cardboard that my sweet and beautiful wife had put in the garage, waiting for her husband to take to recycle. Like any well-thinking preacher, which is sort of a paradox, like any well-thinking preacher, I decided to take that material, and we won't debate the merits of recycling or not, but I waited for a day, Brother Hayes, and you know this because you've experienced it. I suspect when the wind was blowing 60 to 70 miles an hour in Midland, Texas. Yes, with dust whipped up, I waited for that day to load it all up in my truck, to try to strap it down, hope that you get everything tied right so cans and bottles are not flying out of the bags. And I get there, and I am thinking, here I am on the windiest day of the year, and I'm taking all of these black bags and emptying them into the various receptacles for the items to be recycled. And then it hit me. everything that I'm throwing away contained blessings from God. And even the fact that I put them in a truck and could cart off the bags, a blessing from God. But you know, when the wind seems to be blowing against us and tragedy comes and affliction and difficulty, sometimes it's not easy to see the easy blessings, is it? The providential things that God puts in our lives in a marvelous but daily way. Look at verses 7 through 14 of chapter 1. When tragedy strikes, faith can struggle with family who remain. When tragedy strikes, faith can struggle with those who remain. And you've got this exact problem going on in the life of Naomi. She feels so empty. She feels so ill-equipped to not only help herself, but to help Orpah and to help Ruth, her daughters-in-law. I'm past marrying age. I don't have anything to help you with. I cannot provide for you. I am going back to Bethlehem, but you need to stay here. And one of the things that's very interesting that she says, Dave, is, the Lord bless you. The Lord give you rest and give you a husband. She doesn't tell these Moabite women, Chemosh bless you and Chemosh give you peace and a husband. Her faith is taking a hit because of what she's going through. And it's hard to relate to some people that she cares about. But she does seem to want what's best for them. And it seems in her mind that it's best for them to stay in Moab. And neither Orpah or Ruth want to do that. But after Naomi's insistence, with tears, Orpah stays in Moab. Keep looking at chapter 1 with me. It's really important to focus on verse 13 and verses 20 and 21. When tragedy strikes, we may well wrestle with bitterness toward God. When tragedy strikes, we may have to wrestle with bitterness toward God. And what Naomi is saying is everything that's happened when my world came crashing down. Don't call me Naomi anymore, pleasant. Call me Mara, bitter. And the Lord has brought all of this against me. If that doesn't sound like a person that's hurting and struggling with bitterness against God, when tragedy strikes, it's not even unusual for people of faith to look to God with bitterness. And I want to tell you, that's exactly what Naomi is doing. Naomi is not denying God. She's not completely turning her back on God. She wants God to bless Orpah and Ruth, right? She's going back to Bethlehem, and really she doesn't know why, but that's where she's from. Sometimes when tragedy strikes, we struggle with bitterness, and we blame the Almighty. And while we find ourselves complaining about God, we refuse to deny Him. I've got to tell you, I appreciate that about Naomi. While she's struggling with bitterness and blaming God, she will not deny Him. I suspect that there's a lot of people in the church who deny God for far less than what Naomi went through. Notice verses 16 through 22 as the chapter comes to an end. When tragedy strikes, faith can be strengthened and supported from unlikely sources. When tragedy strikes, faith can be encouraged and supported by unlikely sources. Verses 16 and 17 are some of the most precious passages in the Bible, and faith sometimes is seen in the most unlikely of places. Naomi is going to see something about faith from Ruth. To the extent that Ruth says, I am going to be with you and by your side until we die. Your God will be my God. She is saying, I'm willing to go to a place where I'm a foreigner. I'm willing to go to a place where I'm a nobody. And I will go there, Naomi, because of you and because of your God. Faith, when tragedy strikes, can be encouraged and supported in the most unlikely of places. And here is Naomi, bless her heart. She's feeling empty and she has nothing. And she will go from being empty to full. More full than she would have ever thought possible. Because of the providence of God in the life of Ruth. What does this passage tell us about God? God graciously blesses even when tragedy strikes. We may not always be so aware of His gracious blessing, but it's there nonetheless. Chapter 2. Y'all with me? Hopefully your appetite's whetted. You get to chapter 2, we go from on the road to Bethlehem till they get to Bethlehem. And now the setting basically is a barley field. The bulk of the chapter has its setting in a barley field. Ruth is the barley book of the Bible. I just wanted to say that. Barley book of the Bible. Now that I've said it, I feel better. Thank you. We look at Ruth chapter 2, and Ruth 2 is a series of conversations. It's one conversation right after another. Miss Nell, it's 5 different conversations in one chapter. And here's the truth about God that I want you to grasp, since He's the star. Not only does God graciously provide even in our affliction, but God uses normal conversations and the normal activities of life to provide special blessing. God uses the normal conversations, just what we would call normal interaction, and normal circumstances, going to the field to gather so you could have enough to eat. God uses normal conversations and normal circumstances to bless, to provide. Look at the first 3 verses. You've got a conversation between Naomi and Ruth, and it's no wonder that the conversations of this chapter will begin with 2 women talking together. Keep looking. Ruth chapter 2, verses 4 through 8. In the first 3 verses, Ruth is saying, Naomi, what do you think about me going to Boaz's field and gathering there? She says, I think that'll be a mighty fine job. And I want you to focus just a minute on verse 3. Ruth chapter 2, verse 3. I'm reading from the English Standard Version. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened. And she just happened. She happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who just happened to be of the clan of Elimelech. Naomi's deceased husband. Isn't it amazing how often things just happen? Exegete God's providence. You'll see it everywhere. Verses 4 through 7. Boaz has a conversation with some of his servants, some of the gatherers, the reapers. The Lord be with you, the Lord bless you. And then Boaz said to the young men in charge of the reaping, what about this young lady over here? Whose young woman is this? The servant that was in charge of the reapers answered, she is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. Man, you talk about news travels fast. Keep going here. She came to us and said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves. And she came, and she's continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. Now look at verses 8 through 13. Boaz and Ruth. Their initial conversation with one another. Then Boaz says to Ruth, listen, my daughter, do not go and glean in another field or leave this one. Keep close to my young women, and let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. And I have charged the young men not to touch you. When you're thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. Then she fell on her face. You know why? Because someone was being kind to her. Though she was a foreigner and a stranger. Someone is providing comfort and kindness. Boaz is. And when somebody is so kind and is making you feel comfortable, now the natural question is why? Because you kind of wonder if somebody's got an ulterior motive. Why have I found favor in your eyes since I'm a foreigner? Look at chapter 2:11. All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know. And notice verse 12, and it's a key verse. The Lord repay you for what you've done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. And she said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord. You have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants. Let me ask you this. When hurting people come to Bear Valley, do they find kindness and blessing? Aren't you glad Ruth found that in Bethlehem from Boaz? You know, there are some churches, and I'll pick on the preacher since I are one, that hasn't encouraged people very much, been all that kind, or talked about God's kindness and goodness in a long time. Strong on sin, strong on the wrath of God, but not too strong on speaking words of kindness to somebody that's gone through a tragedy and is trying to support someone else who feels empty. Naomi. Conversations continue here. In 14 through 17, Boaz and Ruth talk yet again. Bread and some time together. She sat beside the reapers. He passed her roasted grain. She ate till she was satisfied and had some left over. And when she got up to continue to gather, notice what Boaz does. Surprising goodness. He says to his young men, let her glean even among the sheaves. In other words, let her get extra. And not just let her get extra, but you pull some out that you've already gathered and drop it along the way. And you let her pick that up, and don't rebuke her. Don't stop her. A sense of blessing and encouragement, and maybe some hope for the future in Bethlehem for a foreigner and for her mother-in-law. And then in verses 18 through 23, Ruth goes back with 3/5 of a bushel, an ephah of barley. And two ladies could have lived off that for several days, pretty easy. And she tells Naomi about the events of the day. Now I want to fast forward because I know most here are very familiar with Ruth. I wonder that after Boaz and Ruth marry, if on their first anniversary, and maybe all of the ones that followed, if they didn't hold one another's hands and go back to the barley field where they first met each other. What do you think? A love story began there. A love story that would have an impact on eternity. Chapter 3. Y'all having fun yet? Let's keep looking. The idea in chapter 2 is that God does use people and conversations and the normal affairs of life to provide even greater blessing for us, although we may not be aware of it at the time. We can look back and see it, but at the time it just didn't seem the way it was going to be. Chapter 3. At the threshing floor. At the threshing floor. I call this chapter A Woman's Plan, Cold Feet. A woman's plan, cold feet, and redemption. At the threshing floor. Here is what this chapter tells us about God. And I love this. God often throws in a little suspense with His providence. God is anything but dull and boring. Amen? He often throws in a little bit of suspense in His providence. So we get here to Ruth chapter 3, and that's what I hope you'll remember about God. In the first 5 verses of Ruth chapter 3, you have Naomi's plan. Naomi's plan. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, Ruth, my daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Naomi's thinking, opportunity may be knocking. empty may not be empty. And maybe there is a glimmer of hope in Naomi for the first time in a long time, where her bitterness can be replaced with pleasantness, her name. Keep looking. Isn't Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, she knew exactly where he'd be. He's winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash, therefore, anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. Do not make yourself known to the man until he's finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he'll tell you what to do. And Ruth says, all that you've said, I'll do. Now, you can read this superficially and think, well, this sounds a little manipulative. Ladies, I'm going to take your side on this. Sometimes you have to act to get a man to talk and say exactly what he's thinking. Sometimes, you can't just put it on a Post-it note and stick it on Boaz's thermos and say, do you love me, and do you think that there's a future for us? Many years ago, when I took my wife of now 40 plus years home, and I met her the first time, Johnny Ramsey, a well-known gospel preacher, was there, and I got to meet Johnny at the same time I got to meet my future father-in-law. And those of you who know Johnny, and I know his brother attended this congregation for the older members here, and you remember him, quite a character too. He didn't have anything on Johnny. David didn't. I met Johnny. We exchanged pleasantries. He looked at me after we talked about some of his articles, and he said, why don't you sit down at this chair right here and tell this man exactly what your intentions are concerning his daughter? And then he walked out of the room. And you know what? I told him what my intentions were concerning his daughter. What I'm getting at is Naomi knows something about Boaz and the kind of man that he is. And with but a little encouragement, he'll speak up concerning what's on his heart. Look at verses 6 through 13. The intentions are made known. I'm amazed at how many people want to talk about this being some kind of hanky-panky, that's an old word, or something improper going on here. I don't see it. I don't see it. I got to tell you, she's laying at his feet when he awakens. And then when you look at these verses in chapter 3, she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down, and at midnight the man was startled and turned over. And behold, a woman lay at his feet. He's startled. And he says, who are you? And she says, I am Ruth, your servant. And notice what she says. Ruth 2:12, I told you, was a key verse. Now you get here to Ruth chapter 3. And it says in verse 9, spread your wings over your servant, for you are the Redeemer. The idea is this. Boaz in chapter 2 and verse 12, you prayed that God would be the provider, who would cover me in his wings and redeem. Why don't you be the answer to the very thing that you prayed? Because you are, after all, related to Naomi and Elimelech. And notice verse 11, another key verse. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know you are a worthy woman. In verse 10, what Boaz basically says, is, I suspect, Ruth, you'd have had your choice of all kinds of men, but you're interested in me. He was undoubtedly several years older. And he is humbled that a woman of such character and a woman who's a Moabite who has taken on God as her God would be so interested in him. It's true that I'm a redeemer. Here's where the suspense comes on. God likes to have this little suspense in His providence. But you got to know something. There is a kinsman who is closer than I. And the idea is he gets first crack. He can say, yes, I'll marry you, or he can refuse with minimal embarrassment, I suspect. What he does in the next section is give 6 measures of barley to Ruth. Remember, Ruth is the barley book of the Bible, and she takes the barley to Naomi. Boaz did not want Naomi to be empty. He did not want Ruth to return to Naomi empty-handed. And so she comes with all of this. And Naomi realizes, mission accomplished, but with a wrench in the works, with the nearer servant. You remember years ago there was an old movie called The Grapes of Wrath? Probably many of you had to read the book. But the movie, when it was initially made, remember the old truck? Those people were really poor, you know, in The Grapes of Wrath. But the old truck kind of stands out to me in that movie. It really does. If you've not seen the movie, it's worth watching just for this. When Joseph Stalin was the leader of the Soviet Union, he would not allow the grapes of wrath to be viewed by the Russian people because even the poorest people in America might have had a truck, though old and beaten up and always in need of repair it was. Blessing often depends on perspective, doesn't it? And throughout Ruth, Naomi's perspective on how good God is changes. Chapter 4. Chapter 4, verses 1 through 12. Chapter 4, verses 1 through 12. Now the city gate is the setting. We've gone from the road to Bethlehem to the barley field of Boaz, to the threshing floor, to now the city gate. What is this passage telling us about God? God is always faithful, but God is not always predictable. God is always faithful, but He's not always predictable. You're seeing God at work in Ruth 4, 1 through 12. Notice that the witnesses are called. They're going to give an opportunity to the nearest kinsman to determine whether or not he wants to wed Ruth and be a provider for Naomi and have some property, which is mentioned for the first time, that belongs to Naomi. This guy has a strangely Italian-sounding name, like Petrillo. The near kinsman is Ploni Almoni. Ploni Almoni. You're saying, where is that in Ruth chapter 4, verses 1 and 2? Come here, friend, and sit over here. It's kind of like the name is not given, and we would use so-and-so. Come here, so-and-so. Come here, John Doe. Come here, that guy. You. Over here. Have a seat and let's talk. Ploni Almoni. Ploni Almoni begins to listen to things as Boaz speaks. And you can almost see the guy licking his chops. Because what he's thinking about is here is the opportunity to be a property owner. Thank you. Wave at you too. Denny Petrillo, Ploni Almoni, ladies and gentlemen, right there. Italian living in Bethlehem. Anyway. And it all sounds really good until Boaz says, this will also involve marrying Ruth, providing progeny, if at all possible, children, and the care of Naomi. At which point, Ploni Almoni says, I might not be doing the best thing to pursue this any further. At which point, and this is the Vestal translation, Boaz says, hallelujah! Because I am the next one, and I am more than willing. This is what I want to do. And verses 10 through 12 end with a blessing from those present at the city gates in this proceeding. Now look at verses 13 through 22 in the 2.5 to 3 minutes I have left. What's this about? What's the setting? A wedding, a nursery, and a future. A wedding, a nursery, and a future. That's what it's about. Boaz and Ruth marry. The Lord gave her conception, and she bore a child. Blessed be the Lord, the women say to Naomi. This is literary genius, and you just can't knock the way God tells a story. Every chapter ends by focusing on Naomi and how empty she was. But now, who would have thought it? She's back home in the house of bread. Ruth, who stood beside her and said, I'm not going to leave you, and I'm going to be there till the moment we die, has married Boaz. And Boaz and Ruth have had a little boy. A little boy whose genealogy is spoken of at the end of the book. Obed, David, and we have the book of Ruth. And Naomi would have never realized that in all of her tragedy, God would so bless her through a Moabite woman through whom the Savior, Jesus, the one David would call Lord, would come. Nobody writes a better story than God.